Hello there, and welcome to the first video in the series where we're comparing Total War games and Paradox Interactive's historical series alongside each other to kind of just explore the historical context of the games and how they portray that history. We're starting off in the Roman Republican period, the first period really where the two game series live comfortably alongside each other. Both series have games set in um, sort of older periods, one might say, slightly more mythological periods. But this is the first core historical era, really, where the two game series align. It is interesting to start the series, though, with two games that are fairly controversial, two games that amongst fans are probably amongst the most problematic, really, of the entire series. For Total War, we have Rome 2, the spiritual successor to the much-loved Rome 1, that launched with an awful lot of issues, primarily in terms of performance and bugs, and just generally had an unfinished feel. And given the expectations were so high, the game landed really poorly with fans in that early stage, and that's very much reflected in those scores there that I've pulled out of Metacritic. 76 from critics is not a bad score, good but not great, but 4.4 from users is pretty poor. However, you can see there nearly 4,000 reviews, so clearly a lot of people played the game, but also a lot of people had a pretty negative view of it, particularly on launch. I didn't play the game at launch. I came to it sometime later when there'd been some patching and some improvements made. But even now, there are certainly areas in which the game really struggles. For me, one of the most glaring faults with the game is just the lack of characters, the lack of immersion and role playing that you can get within the game, which puts it in stark contrast to Rome 1, where one of the great strengths was your ability to mold your characters to feel really immersed in the game world by role playing through the characters that you develop. Generals that would develop traits based on their battlefield performance, governors that might take on traits based on their management of settlements. And you got a real feel for the game world through those characters. It really connected you to the sort of historical, to the historicity of it. You know, it gave you a sense of purpose. With Rome 2, the characters across all factions fall really flat. The development of characters doesn't feel at all organic or particularly meaningful. So you might ask then, why have I chosen to play Rome 2 over Rome 1? Well, this is a series that is focusing on historicity. It's focused on it. It's sort of talking about historical fidelity. And in that sense, Rome 2 is far superior to Rome 1. Rome 1 is a very fun game and, like I say, much loved by fans, but has some major issues with how it presents the Roman period. Not least, of course, the variety of factions that you encounter. In Rome 2, there is a great variety of sort of civilized and non-civilized Eastern and Western factions. Whereas in Rome 1, I suppose, just from a gameplay perspective, you know, to create factions of weight across the map. Yeah, a lot of the non-Roman factions are pretty problematic, particularly within Western Europe. You know, you have the Gauls that exist as one sort of concentrated mass, Spain that exists, you know, many centuries out of date as the only faction that sort of occupies the Iberian Peninsula. So yeah, certainly from a historical fidelity standpoint, you know, Rome 2 outdoes Rome 1 significantly. But from a gameplay perspective, Rome 1, much loved, whereas Rome 2, certainly a problematic game. And that's very similar to Imperator Rome. In a way, Imperator Rome suffered from the same issues as Rome 2, in that it had a very poor launch. And again, it's reflected in the scores. Only 37 critic reviews there, but they score exactly the same at 76. So again, a good score, but not a great score. But then you can see the user score somewhat lower at just 5.1. And in a way, a similar kind of experience to Rome 2. The launch for Imperator Rome was pretty poor, but whereas Rome 2 suffered from issues of sort of game design and polishing, I think Imperator Rome suffered as much from Paradox's own commercial strategy as it did from the quality of the game on launch. For anyone who follows and is familiar with Paradox's historical titles, the MO for some time now has been to release a kind of basic vanilla game on launch, a game that is good, but clearly lacks some features, with the view being that they can develop and expand and build the game up over years following launch, bringing fans back to the game repeatedly through DLCs, expansions, and other additional content. But in order to do that, you need that initial audience. You need to be able to launch a game that might feel incomplete, but is not unfulfilling for the player. So, a game that is a 7, 8, or a 9 out of 10, with the expectation being that post-launch you can turn it into a 10 out of 10 classic, along the lines of what we've seen with Europa Universalis 4, with Crusader Kings 2, games that we'll talk about later in this series. But with Imperator Rome, and that's reflected in the user score here, it probably didn't launch as a 7, 8, or a 9 out of 10 game, more of a 4, 5, or 6 out of 10 game. It was a little bit bland, didn't resonate with fans, and Paradox sort of quickly thought that, well, without that initial audience, it's going to be a lot of hard graft to pull players into the game who haven't had that initial interest through all the DLC and additional content pipeline, and Imperator Rome was axed very shortly after launch, it seems. It has had a bit of a renaissance of late, with this video coming out in summer 2024. But yeah, it's a game that also suffered from a bad launch, but whereas it was perhaps not as technically cursed as Rome 2, it was kind of cursed by the strategy that Paradox had behind it. So yeah, a bit of a surprise, I suppose, to start a series based on video games that I've enjoyed and loved to play over the years, with two games that are so problematic within their own sort of gaming histories. But let's move on to the history themselves, the history that they're looking to portray through the game. So both games start off at the beginning of Rome's great expansion across Europe during the Republican period. They do start at slightly different times, however. Rome 2 starts in 272 BC, whereas Imperator Rome starts in 304, and the difference is quite important. 272 BC sees Rome as a dominant force in the Italian peninsula. Rome has been successful against enemies within central Italy, the Samnite Wars, and other conflicts with neighboring Italian tribes, Italian city-states, and has also been victorious in the Pyrrhic Wars that end shortly before the start of the game and leave Rome as a dominant force in southern Italy as well. Pyrrhus, of course, a noted and lauded commander of the ancient world, invades southern Italy and Sicily, is ultimately repulsed from the Pyrrhic Wars, we get the phrase the Pyrrhic victory. Pyrrhus is victorious in a number of battles, as in he and his forces control the field at the end of the conflict, but his losses are great, his supply lines are stretched, and we get the sort of term that, you know, with every victory brings him closer to defeat, hence the phrase Pyrrhic victory, a victory that ultimately reduces resources, reduces manpower, and reduces your ability to continue a war. So I think the phrase that's attributed goes along the lines of any more of these victories and we will face defeat, something along those lines. But we get the Pyrrhic Wars, which ultimately leads Rome to being dominant in central and southern Italy. And as we get beyond, you know, the start date, Rome begins her expansion through the Mediterranean. So we have the Punic Wars, we have the Macedonian Wars, and Rome expands, occupies, vassalizes territories to become a dominant empire throughout the Mediterranean and the Near East, Central Europe. Rome too then sort of wraps up about year zero. There isn't actually a fixed end date. However, the research tree and other sort of game features kind of wind down as you approach year zero. For Imperator Rome, that earlier start date, about 30 years prior, actually shifts the focus of the early game quite significantly, because Rome hasn't been victorious in the Samnite Wars yet, hasn't been victorious in the Pyrrhic Wars yet. So is a strong force within central Italy, but far from a dominant force across the Italian peninsula. So if you are playing as Rome, your first task in Imperator Rome is to establish control over central and southern Italy. Whereas in Rome 2, you're already set up to start expanding across the Mediterranean. The early game focus for Imperator Rome is in fact further east. In 304 BCE, we still haven't seen the climactic resolution of the wars of the Diadochi. So the Diadochi are the successors to Alexander. Alexander the Great has successfully invaded Persian Empire, but dies young, and the vast territory that has been conquered fractures with regions taken over by his most trusted and loyal generals. They're now in the process of fighting it out to try and reunite Alexander's empire under one ruler. And we're now heading towards the culmination of that process with the Fourth War of the Diadochi. The Diadochi themselves now are starting to age. They will shortly start dying out, and with their passing, so too passes their legitimacy, really, and the motivation and resource to continue fighting for control of all of Alexander's empire. So we get a consolidation of the various territories of Alexander's empire under the governors, the generals that had been loyal to Alexander. So we get Ptolemaic Egypt, we get Seleucid Empire under Seleucus, but we're heading towards that culmination there. So in the early game for Imperator Rome, the focus is very much further east in Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant, where the successors to Alexander are still fighting it out for control of his empire. So that changes the early game focus in particular, and it does change the trajectory, really, of campaigns, with strong factions forming in the east. As the game develops, it is harder for Rome to establish itself, particularly as a dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean, because these Diadochi factions have had that extra game time, if you like, to establish themselves as strong, concentrated forces able to resist Rome. And so the shift in date not only changes the focus of the early game, but it also changes the trajectory, really, of the mid to late game. But it's interesting that Imperator Rome has a hard finish in 27 BCE. So both games look to wrap up as you approach year zero, if you like, at the end of the Roman Republican period. And it's quite clear why that's the case. Roman expansion from, let's say, the 270s to 27 BCE is extreme. We go from the local force to the regional power to a truly continental power controlling vast territories. And in the imperial period that comes after 27 BCE, Roman expansion is far slower. In fact, Roman expansion is heavily reduced. So for both games, the gameplay focuses on imperial expansion, with both games not continuing deep into the Roman imperial period, because that expansionist play style isn't necessarily so sort of historically viable. So Imperator Rome, you aren't forced, if you will, to go into the imperial period, but you can change government types as the game develops. But the game has that hard finish in 27 BCE, which in our historical timeline is the culmination of various civil wars and conflicts within Rome that leads to the imperial period, with Augustus becoming the first Roman emperor in that year. So both games look to wrap up at the same time because that is the natural culmination of Rome's expansion, if you will. But the start date does change the focus of the early game, change the trajectory of the campaign overall, and so leads to quite different play styles when you are involved. And it's quite natural that that's the case. For creative assembly and total war, conflict is the emphasis. So when you start off as Rome in 272, you're immediately thrown into a scenario where, as a dominant power, you are looking to kind of throw your weight around. Whereas for Imperator Rome, a game that includes sort of more diplomatic mechanics, that leans into that paradox sort of social and political gameplay, there is more work to do to establish yourself both as an economic, military, and political power in Italy as well as the Mediterranean. So thinking of the period that is being portrayed then, what key themes would we see included? Well, the first I thought about was just political intrigue. Generally speaking, I think whether you're someone who has a deep understanding of the Roman period or somebody with more casual interest, I think political intrigue might be the first thing that comes to mind. I think any game set in the Roman period, whether it's competing for power in the Senate, whether it's using sort of military accomplishments to further the glory of Rome and glory of your name, these are all features that we'll see a lot in media around the Roman period and is thematic for the time. So any game set in this period, one would say, would need quite robust mechanics that allow not only for sort of military expansion and gameplay, but also social and political skullduggery, mechanics that allow for a bit more than simply military engagement to be your main process of aggrandizement. And it very much depends on how the game is framed. Both in Imperator Rome and Rome 2, you kind of are the nation. You control all aspects in one way, shape, or form. But for any game set in this period, having some kind of political gameplay that allows you to exert soft power as a faction externally, or allows you to seek advancement over your rivals internally, something that one would expect to be included. And to be honest with you, one thing that I'd say that both games struggle with, like I say, I didn't come to Rome 2 at launch, but certainly that kind of gameplay seems to be incredibly limited. Very forgettable features, really, very inconsequential features that allow for that kind of political action against your rivals, internally and externally. Diplomacy in Total War has always been a bit of a myth, with the emphasis being on military engagement. But I think in Rome 2, they really did miss the target quite considerably. Now, of course, both games have Rome at the center, but also allow gamers to play with other factions. And this is certainly something that would translate across all factions. I mean, if you're playing as Egypt, for example, in this time period, the rivalry between claimants to the position of Pharaoh, for example. I mean, that you can have a whole gameplay area in itself, which is simply about managing succession and managing the flows of dynastic rule for any faction in the game. And a lot of that doesn't need to be military, but also political intrigue. And as I say, for Rome 2, both for Roman and other factions, it does miss the mark with some very inconsequential political and diplomatic gameplay. And I'd say the same applies to Imperator Rome. I did find with my playthroughs that, for example, if there was a problematic succession, perhaps a very young character was the heir to the throne if I was a monarchic faction. Very little happened. Just a lot of inconsequential political gameplay, I think, in both games, massively underplayed. And this is one of the great shames of Imperator Rome, for example. I mean, that's something that might have ended up being developed quite significantly if there was more support post-launch. But for me, both games missed the mark on this by not prioritizing a gameplay style that includes diplomatic and political intrigues alongside the militaristic approach. Now, the second theme I went for was societal diversity, and I suppose the issue, what we're sort of exploring here is, you get further into the ancient world, one community to the next, one valley side to the next might well be speaking a different language, worshipping different gods, have very different, supply and demand issues when it comes to resources. And so having that kind of internal intricacy, I think, would be very important. Managing relationships between communities, between population centers, to allow, again, for just a slightly more nuanced approach to social and economic gameplay. This is, again, because of Total War's ultimately quite sort of simplistic style, it's not a feature that I'd say is particularly prominent in Rome 2. Unrest is unrest, as it is in many other Total War games. If you plonk a large enough garrison in a settlement, give a particular region, preferential taxation, reduce taxation, or there are edicts that can, increase public order. I mean, ultimately, it's just through sort of a handful of gameplay features and actions that allow you to sort of manipulate public order and issues of social unrest. So it's not a feature that's particularly well developed, one would say, in Rome 2. But it is a very central part of the game in Imperator Rome. The culture system is probably, it's kind of the emphasis of the game, which I think is a very interesting way of putting it, because it means that one of the key themes in Imperator Rome is the idea of the occupied and the occupier, with expansion being one of the main processes for success within the game. as your culture becomes the controlling culture, you have to manage the interactions with your subjugated cultures very carefully. And it's a great source of tension throughout the game, is creating the right policies and the right kind of rights and privileges to your subjugated cultures to allow for sort of peaceful coexistence. The aim of the game in Imperator Rome is very much to create a harmonious empire, not even necessarily a large empire, but certainly a harmonious empire. And as such, societal diversity and the intricacies of having a an occupied and an occupier culture is central to Imperator Rome's expansion, and overall sort of gameplay intrigues. And I think this is very thematic for the period. Roman culture certainly had its allure, if you like. I mean, whether you're playing as Rome or any other faction across the game, like I say, that relationship between the occupied and the occupier is a very important one to kind of define the cohesion of your empire as you expand. And in Imperator Rome, that is absolutely central to gameplay, and I think very, very well represented. The final theme I was going to talk about is just the dominance of the legion. Again, if you think of the Roman period, if you think of any media about Rome and the Roman Republic, the legionary will come to mind. The legionary, the cohort, the military might and power of Rome. So I think having this represented within the game again is something that would be key to creating a Roman era game. And again, sort of the overall game design kind of dictates how these two games approach it. For Rome 2, you are dealing with the units on a more intimate level. You are leading them into battle. You're seeing them interact on your campaign. And so you do have that sense of growing power, whether it's the triplice axis and deploying your Astarte, your Principes, and that evolving into the legionary cohort. You get that sense of evolution, you get that sense of militarism and power of the Roman armed forces, and the dominance that that sort of military establishment has in the late game is pronounced. So you certainly get that sensation in Rome 2, which I'd say you don't get in Imperator Rome. You can recruit legions. They are superior forces, but often I didn't feel they were that superior to levies. It didn't feel you didn't have that same sense of power, sense of dominance once you reach sort of later game units. So yeah, and again, just a lot to do with game design. Imperator Rome, you're not on the battlefield, you're not seeing those forces in action. And even though in Rome 2, the bugs are present, how the units behave on the battlefield isn't particularly great. But nonetheless, you get that sense of power. You can actually see the units, their ornate uniforms. You can see the shield wall formations. You can deploy in the triplice axis, sort of historically loyal battle formations, etc. You can see the legion in action. The simple fact that within Imperator Rome you can't kind of detracts from a key theme, I think, for the period, which would be the emerging dominance of the Roman military machine. So I kind of scored these areas just so we've got something to sort of compare. I think, as you can see, game design really plays into where the focus of these games lie. So when I'm scoring this, I'm scoring it with a 3 if it's, very good, a 2 if it's good, a 1 if it's there but not great, and then a 0 if the feature just isn't there at all. And then fun factor at the end there, just a 1 or a 0. So is the game fun or not? Well, both games are fun. I'll say that off the bat. But yeah, game design really leans, really emphasizes how these games present the history for Rome 2 because of the emphasis on conflict and because of that sort of visual feedback, being on the battlefield. A lot of those key features, political intrigue, societal diversity, I think really fall away. But the dominance of the legion is present. On the flip side, Imperator Rome, the political intrigues and the dominance of the legion feel fairly weak, but societal diversity, the cultural interaction, and the importance of sort of occupier versus occupied cultures as sort of the central intrigue of the game means that that's where the focus lies. So both games, attempt to present, I think, the historical themes well, but they fall short because of their overall game design and the sort of gameplay foci. I mean, in this instance, Rome 2 coming out ever so slightly ahead. I don't know if that's entirely representative. This is fairly sort of finger in the wind stuff. But I think it's just interesting to think about how the core design of the game influences how the history is portrayed. There's some really interesting things happening in Imperator Rome on that cultural level, but it's kind of let down, if you like, by a lack of weight to the political side, and perhaps a lack of importance to the militarism that comes out of the dominance of the legion. The flip side for Rome is it very much just Rome 2, it very much focuses on the militarism to the detriment of societal and political factors. So we'll have a little look then at how my gameplay kind of interacted with that history. Okay, so we'll see how historically loyal the campaigns are. So we're starting off with Imperator Rome here, and when I was thinking of which factions to play as, I thought, well, one of the concepts behind this series is kind of challenging history, if you like. So I chose a small range of fairly important factions within the history of the expansion of Rome, with the idea being, could I beat history? So could I get to the end date? Could I get to 27 BCE and still be an existent faction? In that middle column, you'll see the date of the faction's sort of collapse. And there are some points to note here. The difference in start date is quite important from 272 to 304, particularly if you look down there to Macedon. We actually have Macedon defeated in 294, so sometime before Rome 2 actually begins, and this Macedon is absorbed by the Antigonid dynasty at the end of the Wars of the Diadochi. So the Macedon we start with in Rome 2, and the Macedon we start with in Imperator Rome are kind of two different Macedons. They still control similar territories, obviously focusing on modern-day Greece and parts of Anatolia, but the dynasty in control of Macedon is different because of the culmination of the Wars of the Diadochi. So we have the Greek factions there, defeated over the course of the Macedonian Wars, absorbed into the Roman Empire around about 168. You got Carthage further down. Obviously, one of the defining wars of Roman history, the Punic Wars, early defeats, early setbacks to the likes of Hannibal and his campaigns, but Rome manages to counterattack, manages to resist, manages to invade Northern Africa, destroy Carthage, and emerge victorious as a dominant force in the Mediterranean at that point. As you can see, though, on the right there, these are my scores. So the scoring system for Imperator Rome is interesting, and again, it reflects the kind of gameplay emphasis being the creation of a harmonious empire, a cohesive empire. If you like, it's the score is almost number, in essence, number of pops versus happiness. So you can have a very large empire, but if you aren't managing those cultures effectively, then your happiness might be fairly low. So let's say you've got a, empire of 100 that has a happiness of 10 coming out at 1,000. You can flip that. So you can have a fairly small empire, but a very culturally homogeneous, harmonious empire that has a happiness of 100 as opposed to a population of 10, and that's also going to come out at 1,000. So you can certainly play tall in Imperator Rome very effectively. Indeed, that's a very prominent gameplay style in Imperator Rome, one that isn't going to be present in Rome 2, which, because of Creative Assembly's Total War gameplay style, is all about expansion and dominance in terms of territory. So you can see here, Rome was my top score there, approaching 1,700. But then a number of prominent Greek factions. You've got Epirus, you've got Thrace there, both scoring in excess of 12,000. And I think Greek factions are very interesting to play as in Imperator Rome. Expanding within Greece is a lot of fun. There are a lot of factions, a lot of smaller factions as well that you can interact with and absorb. But then the cultural homogeneity really comes through in those scores. Once you dominate Greece, because of the prevalence of Hellenic culture in that region, you can create, very powerful, harmonious, cohesive factions coming out of Greece. Obviously, based on those IRL dates, they were ultimately defeated by Rome. But in Imperator Rome, Greece is a great source of strength, and you can really dominate from that territory. Heading further east, you've got the Seleucid Empire, which again, survives to the end, the Egyptian Empire that survives to the end. And these are very interesting factions because you have Hellenic rulers, but you're not in Greece. You're in Egypt, you're in, the Far East. And therefore, and those sort of slightly lower scores are then reflected in the difficulty that comes from the cultural heterogeneity. It's very difficult to have that same harmony and cohesion when your dominant culture is at odds with the local culture and you are constantly battling the frictions of the occupied and the occupier. So it does lead some really fascinating campaigns if you are playing as Egypt or the Seleucids, for example. Yeah, a far trickier balance as you expand as a Hellenic sort of leadership of sort of largely non-Hellenic local cultures. Yeah, so as you can see, going down the list, I managed to survive with all of the factions, Ivernia being sort of a faction of Gaul. Yeah, struggled there. There was one war towards the end. I think I was doing fairly well, but then I lost a war towards the end of the campaign that tanked my score. But in each of these playthroughs, I did finish in the top 10. Now, Imperator Rome doesn't have like an end game screen like many Paradox games. It's quite a low key end to the game when you hit that hard finish in the year 27. But I went back and I just collected the top 10 scores from my campaigns. And these are the averages then. So these include the human and the computer performances. And these were sort of the top 10 across all of my campaigns. So this kind of gives you an idea then, I suppose, of sort of the ancient world as, according to Imperator Rome. So interesting, you can see at the bottom there, 27 factions only appeared in one campaign top 10. So that just shows you the variety of outcomes that are possible in Imperator Rome, the variety of factions that can emerge. So these factions all appeared in 3 or more. So 27 appeared in only one, and 30 in total appeared outside of the top 10. So there were 3 that appeared in 2, basically. and 27 that appeared in 1. So all of these appeared in 3 or more. Rome once again comes out on top. You then have another Greek faction featuring prominently, Maurya, so they're off in India. Parthia, again, an eastern faction, Seleucid Empire, an eastern faction, Bosporan Kingdom, sort of an emergent eastern faction around the Black Sea. Trinovantia is an interesting one. They're from Britain. They sort of start out in the southeast of England, as we know it today. And yeah, Britain is very much Battle Island, lots of minor factions. Rome very rarely gets there, so Britain is basically allowed to evolve into, an advanced barbarian society. I mean, a very interesting alternate world there if the Trinovantia had emerged as sort of the great unifiers of England, in this ancient period. Egypt down there again, a very powerful faction, but the computer is, also struggling with the friction of the cultural diversity within the faction. Carthage, also a survivor, as opposed to its historical inspiration. And then at the bottom there, Avolitia. So this is a faction that emerges in the Middle East. So that's another emergent faction that sort of spawns out of the eastern end of the map, sort of out of reach of Rome's expansion. And I suppose this is, part of the theme we're seeing here. There are some factions close to Rome that can challenge Rome and do thrive, such as Thrace in this instance. But many others are sort of beyond the reach of Rome. The Maurya over in Italy, the Seleucids, the Bosporans, the Trinovantia up in Britain, they're further away. Carthage is an interesting example. Whether you're playing Rome as a human player or as a computer, Rome and Carthage will be drawn into war with each other, but such is the spread of the Carthaginian Empire, they are more than capable of surviving the period, often as a sort of largely Iberian empire. Carthage may well lose territory to the Romans in central Mediterranean and northern Italy, northern Africa. But they do have territories in Iberia and can sort of reimagine themselves as an Iberian empire. And again, a fascinating alternate history if Rome had been slightly less victorious, if you will, against Carthage, and had allowed the empire to persist in Iberia. Creating sort of a coherent Iberian empire, perhaps a later challenge Rome. I mean, a very, very interesting outcomes based on how Imperator Rome portrays that conflict. So Rome 2. Now, this is an interesting one, a bit of a confession here. Rome 2's campaigns, I did find, can get quite boring if you're not playing Rome. So these are all not end of game ratings, but around about the year 150 BCE. And I did that because, whether you're successful or unsuccessful, if you like, as a non-Roman faction, the sort of desire to expand just isn't really there. There isn't really much intrigue in the sort of mid to later game, apart from simply mowing through neighboring factions that could well be allies that you've had very positive relationships with for generations. You suddenly feel you have to destroy simply to hit the targets in terms of territories. And for me, that always came around about 150, around about 150. So you've played about half of the campaign. You're probably dominant in your local territory, and to expand further, you may well be just plowing into allies, and just doing things that just didn't feel particularly, say, natural. Or the flip side, you basically had a dross campaign, you haven't really got going, and it's very hard to catch up, as is the case with Epirus in particular down the bottom. It starts out weak, and I played through once and I was like, I'm not going to do this again. So these are all scores around about the year 150, and I've compared the factions on where they stand against each other in those 5 areas at the bottom there. Most settlements, tech, battles won, win percentage, and highest income. Rome comes out on top, but again, similar themes really, I suppose, to Imperator Rome. Rome comes out on top, but there are factions that can resist closer to them, such as Macedon, such as the Iverni, indeed, including Epirus. But there are factions slightly further away, slightly out of the reach of Rome, that can also sort of, maintain a degree of strength. The Egyptians, the Seleucids. So this kind of shows that, Rome's expansion in the Mediterranean, as portrayed by both games, was far from a given. In both games, you can adequately resist, whether it's the computer or whether it's human-led, you can adequately resist Roman expansion, and particularly in Greece. And very strong emergent very strong empires can maintain power further east, and generally be rivals to Rome in the later game, rather than simply other factions within the world. They can achieve a certain amount of development and parity with Rome. And I suppose that goes to how, within the game world, you have parallel expansion. Factions can develop their economies, they can develop their societies, their military strengths in parallel, whereas Rome sort of goes through a period of great acceleration of military and political might. And again, it comes back to those themes that, Rome's early expansion wasn't simply about conquest, particularly when you look at the Macedonian Wars. There was a lot of political intrigue. There was a lot of sort of interventionist approaches that allowed Rome not to sort of directly control territories, but to lead to sort of client-state relationships, across pockets of the Mediterranean, that sort of allowed those sort of bridgeheads for later expansion. So, yeah, as we said earlier, sort of the lack of the sort of political elements to expansion kind of reduces Rome's capacity for dominance in both games, in a way, when the player can develop in parallel and effectively resist without having that sort of political power come to bear on top of the military. So just sort of three conclusions then. What can we say? Well, unsurprisingly, both games focus on the primacy of Rome. So you saw there in both games how we scored them and how we approached the sort of gameplay and sort of historically loyal gameplay design. Rome is the center, Rome is the point, and Roman expansionism is the focus of the game. In both games, Rome doesn't emerge as powerful as it did in our world, and that points to the incredible feats of Rome in terms of its political, its military, and its political machinations that lead it to become this force, this empire that spans Europe, across the Mediterranean and into the Middle East. So in both games, Rome is a dominant force in the Mediterranean, but not the dominant force in the Mediterranean. Partly that's because the games perhaps overplay the resilience of Greece and to a lesser extent Carthage. Again, you could see there that Rome's first major sort of territorial acquisitions, they come from successes in the Punic War, successes in the Macedonian Wars. So had Greek factions, had Macedonia been able to resist Rome in that early period, what would have been the trajectory of the Roman Empire had Carthage been able to resist more effectively in the tail end of the Punic Wars, or been more punishing in the earlier phases? How would have Rome's trajectory played out. How different would the Mediterranean look? And in both instances, in both games, Carthage and the Greek factions are able to resist better than they did historically. And that in turn leads to this sort of final observation that with greater resistance from Carthage and from Greece, factions further east have far greater opportunity to develop and become rivals to Rome. Because of that sort of distance and the fact that interactions with Rome are, in terms of military interactions at least, are limited in the early game, but also because of that resistance experienced in Greece and Carthage slows any soft or hard power expansion of Rome further east. So these are sort of three observations, and two at least that are sort of at odds with our own history. And kind of show how gameplay features within the two games influence how we experience the history of that period. I suppose the question is, both games do focus on the primacy of Rome, but in both games, is Rome just not powerful enough? I think if that is the case, then it comes back to the mechanics of the game and how both games perhaps underplay the political power that Rome had in this period. And that's, again, partly a result of other gameplay decisions. For Rome 2, it's the emphasis on military at the cost of political. And for Imperator Rome, it's kind of the emphasis on culture and society at the cost of political power. Okay, folks, well, a bit to chew on there. Thanks for listening in. Next video, we're moving on to the medieval period. So I may well see you there. Bye for now.